So a good friend of ours had this quote. And it was his quote, so I want to give him credit for it. But he said, when you first start getting into politics, you read Frederick Bastiat, and you read Milton Friedman, and you read Murray Rothbard and Friedrich Hayek, and you become a libertarian because you just want to be left alone. And then one day you realize that they're never going to leave you alone, and you become something else. And I think a lot of people, a lot of us, have felt like lately we've become something else. And the question is, do we still believe in a lot of the ideas that we have, these ideas of freedom, these ideas of limited government, these ideas that can be considered classically liberal? Or is something starting to change? And so what we're going to talk about today is the use of government power. And we're going to talk about 3 different perspectives, all of them on the right, on the appropriate use of government power. What does that look like? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our political prognosticator, our resident historian, the Oracle of Virginia, and I don't know, future Caesar of the American Empire, Christian I.
I'm calling for one. I don't plan to be one.
You used to call him the warlord in training. I'm not sure what happened with that.
We did say warlord in training.
We came up with some other nickname at some point too.
Yeah.
Somebody on the internet did.
Yeah.
But this is the second episode in a row where I am really excited to be doing this. I've been waiting a long time to do this.
Yeah.
And I'm super glad that more people on the right kind of have come around to realizing what time it is.
Well,
we all
see.
have started to get to this point.
We're going to see. I have a feeling that throughout this episode, I'm going to be the one
reeling us in.
The two of you to be like, whoa, like just back it up a little bit here, back it up a little bit. But here's the framing. So let's frame this up. For the longest time now, and we've talked about this in several other podcasts, where the left has increasingly treated the right like enemies. And the right has always pushed back against this. This has started all the way back. You can go back to William F. Buckley Jr., where he said, and I think there's some others too. It wasn't just Buckley, but it was one of the core problems that we have is the right thinks the left is wrong and the left thinks the right is evil. And that's that distinction. That's the distinction between one group thinking that we're fellow countrymen with generally similar beliefs and ideas and some sort of vague notion of where we want to go, although there's some differences. And then one side looking at you going, no, you're my enemy. I think you're evil. I think what you believe is wrong. And I think it needs to be eradicated. I think it needs to be defeated. And you can either become my ally or we can destroy you. And that sounds very hyperbolic until you look at what happened with Charlie Kirk, where he was not only murdered for actually giving, I would say, a good account of conservative ideas and beliefs, a good account of Christian ideas and beliefs, and trying to do it in a way that was very, very civil. He wanted to have more discussions because he was afraid that if we didn't have more discussions, violence would ensue. And yet here we are. He was murdered. And it wasn't just that he was murdered. It was the left's reaction to his murder that caused a lot of us to start to reevaluate. Because yes, it's always appropriate to try to live in peace with other people. But if they don't want to live in peace with you, what do you do then? Do you just continue to attempt to live in peace? Or do you start to fight back? I would argue that I didn't want to see the left as my enemy, but they declared that I was their enemy. And now I'm just not disagreeing with them anymore. But what does that mean? Well, in an episode a while back, we talked about kind of these 5 areas, this key terrain within society. We talked about politics. We talked about family. We talked about arts and entertainment. We talked about media. We talked about government. And education. Education was the 5th one. And we asked, okay, what has happened within these culturally shaping institutions within our society? And what we found is that the left has been incredibly effective at getting intellectual capture of almost all of these areas to a degree to where they are shaping influence. But now the right has woken up to it. And it's about fighting back for each one of these areas. It's about going into these areas and telling the left, no, you can't have it. And we're going to stop pretending that we're all on the same side and just have slightly different ideas. No, we realize that we are now in a battle between 2 diametrically opposed worldviews, and one is going to win and one is going to lose. And so the next several episodes that we're going to go over are going to be talking about each area, each piece of key terrain that we need to fight with. And the first one is this realm of government and politics. Now, the perspectives that we're going to talk about have to do with those three, right? It's the people on the right that kind of still argue that, whenever something happens, whenever Donald Trump is doing something that might be a little outside the norm, the immediate response is, well, this sets a very bad precedent. This is a dangerous precedent. If you set this up, if you do this, well, then what happens when the left is back in power? Then you have another group that is saying Donald Trump's not going far enough. He needs to be pushing every single boundary he possibly can. He needs to be going after his political enemies. He needs to be using lawfare just as much as they use it against him. He needs to be going for all these gray areas. Send the National Guard into every blue city you possibly can. That's the group that we're kind of
Christian's
affectionately...
over here nodding his head.
Nick doesn't see. I'm like,
that's
the
me.
whole time I'm sitting here
That's the
nodding.
group we're affectionately calling the Hail Caesar group, right?
That's Christian.
And then there's another group. There's another group that looks at this and they say, okay, I'm one of those people. I'm one of those people that I read Friedman and I read Hayek and I read Rothbard and I read all these guys. And I am legitimately concerned about the concentration of political power. I believe in the federalist system. I believe in the separation of powers. I believe in checks and balances. But are there any legitimate ways that we can use these power structures that we believe in order to push back? And that is the nature of the conversation today. So
we get to spend the entire conversation on the analysis. This is a unique.
Yeah, we're gonna go into those ideas and talk about it. But first, before I get to that, I want to thank True Classic, because the bottom line is, as many of you know, I was not the first one to discover True Classic. It was my beautiful bride Tina who said, you know what, Nick, I think it's time you throw out some of these T-shirts with a bunch of holes and stains on them and actually have something that's somewhat presentable. And I pushed back at first because why would you throw out these perfectly good, T-shirts with a bunch of coffee stains on them? But she insisted. And the moment I put one on, I was like, oh, this fits a little bit different. This fits the way I would like it to fit in the shoulders, arms, and chest, and maybe leaves a little bit of extra breathing room around the midsection where I'm still working on that right there. And that's the magic of True Classic, is that the stuff fits dudes the way shirts should fit dudes, right? Women have all kinds of stuff where it's catering to their size and their shape and everything else. But men, we just pretty much just buy whatever we find at the box store. Well, no more. True Classic is here to make sure that you look good for your lady. Because as I've said before, if your wife likes to put it on you, she might like to take it off you. And that's very, very important. So go to trueclassic.com/Nick and check out all of the different options that they have. I'm currently wearing the short sleeve button down, but I have all their t-shirts. I have their long sleeve, their formals. I love their workout gear. The workout gear is great. trueclassic.com/Nick, or you can also find it at Costco or Target. So when you accidentally let your wife loose in Target and you're wondering what you're going to do for the next 3 hours, you can go over and get some True Classic. And then the trip is not a complete waste, right? Provided that, anyway. So trueclassic.com/Nick, go check them out. And we thank them for sponsoring this episode. Okay. Christian, what do you say? Like, I want you, because you are probably the most hostile to this particular group, right? When it comes to the conservatives who immediately rush out there and do the what about argument, right? Well, God, this is dangerous. What if the left started using lawfare against us? What's your response to them?
I mean, have you been living under a rock for the last 20, 30 years?
Yeah, whenever they say, could you imagine? I'll be like, what do you mean, can I imagine? We've experienced it. We've been living through it.
Yeah. This whole time, the shoe has already, the shoe, what if the shoe was on the other foot? Well, I got news for you. The shoe's been on the other foot this entire time. And they haven't been worried about it at all. And that's a problem. We need to make sure they're worried about it.
Shoe.
Okay, but can we do that? Can we steel man the argument?
Sure. So the argument is this. It's a classically liberal. It's an argument that actually I used to espouse.
Yes.
Nobody who knows me, except in person, people like you or my friends or family knows this, because the entire time that I've been on the internet, people just know me as, this right-wing post-liberal guy. But I used to be a libertarian.
Yeah.
I used to espouse these same arguments. So, I mean, I can do it quite well. The argument is simple. It's power concentrated. It's the Lord Acton quote, right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, we're going to equate power in respect, in many respects with evil. And anything that exercises power is an act of corruptibility that could descend into evil. And so if you're going to be wielding power, let alone if you're going to be wielding power in a powerful executive, then that's extremely dangerous.
Well, and I think
the whole principle, I mean, ever since the Magna Carta, right, the whole principle within English common law and English tradition, English liberalism, has been the decentralization of power and the limitation on government power. And so if you're espousing for more power to be used, you're basically saying, it's effectively saying, let's use the ring of Sauron to defeat Sauron.
Yeah. Well,
but you already know where I'm about to go with the response to that.
You pointed this out, that the ring of power could be destroyed in Tolkien because the way Tolkien wrote it.
But it's also worth noting that the ring is misidentified as being synonymous with power, when in reality the ring is evil, not power.
And that's the distinction I want to make, is that because they call it the ring of power, all of a sudden the kind of within culture, not just within like Lord Acton, but culturally we look at that as, okay, yeah, the goal should be to destroy the ring of power because it's the power that's wrong. And in reality, when you look at what, Sauron in the Lord of the Rings poured into it, it's like he poured his malice, he poured his, it was this idea of a corrupting power that was utilized in order to bring about evil. And that's what was being destroyed. And how do we know that Tolkien was not uncomfortable with some elements of power? Well, because there's kingdoms everywhere. Like Rohan is a kingdom, right? Like Minas Tirith is the capital of
Gondor.
Gondor, right? So no, he's distinguishing between legitimate power and illegitimate power. But one of the things that was important about that is there was also a distinction between the corruption of absolute power. It was Sauron's desire to rule everyone and to bring everything under his control as an evil ruler. So to the extent that power should be opposed, absolutely. But that's not the same as saying that all power is somehow illegitimate or bad. The thing that I think, and again, I
would argue?
I've made similar arguments, but I think some of those arguments are still legitimate.
Well, can I bring this back to reality and what we have right
you don't
now?
Like the allegory?
Hold on.
We're still winning the argument.
I would like to give an example of something that's a steel man that really exists.
Okay.
How about that? We have right now the filibuster. And we also have certain House rules and Senate rules that are guidelines that are in place that cause the left to be able to shut down the government.
Causes either side to be able to shut down.
Whatever. Anyway, the point of this is we hear this argument constantly, like we can't get rid of the filibuster because they might use the the lack of the filibuster against us when they get power. And it's this idea that we know power changes hands constantly, and we know that eventually they will have power. And so, and I tend to subscribe to this way of thinking to an extent, but I think you can be really afraid of your own shadow in this way of looking at things. And I used to always say you can tell if something is good policy or not based on, does it matter who's wielding it? Does it matter who's in charge for this to be a good policy? So there are certain things I would love as long as our people are in charge. But the minute the left gets in charge, I know this would be very bad.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that way of looking at things that, to me, that's the steel man of this argument.
No, I agree. And I'll give a practical example, not one from Lord of the Rings. Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security was set up by the Bush administration post 9/11, primarily to provide coordination. You had a couple things that were established. One was the Director of National Intelligence, because they felt like there was too many stovepipes with respect to information being shared across agencies in order to be able to combat terrorist organizations. Department of Homeland Security was there to try to make universal standards with respect to airport security, along with the other things the Department of Homeland Security does. And in the midst of that crisis, one could look at those things and say, I understand why the federal government wants to establish these things in order to address this problem that happened. And there was a libertarian argument against those things, saying if you set up a Department of Homeland Security, it's going to become a nightmare. It's going to be super expensive, and it's going to become an absolute nightmare. Same thing with Director of National Intelligence. So this idea that you're creating this kind of super intelligence coordination spot, and now there's going to be questions of, the FBI coordinating with the CIA, and we're supposed to keep those things between domestic and foreign. And those were legitimate concerns. And so my whole thing would be, I don't think we should immediately throw it out, but by the same token, I am frustrated with this idea that any time power is wielded by the right, the instant response is, well, imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. And I'll give you an example of where I find this frustrating. There was some backlash against Donald Trump going after drug traffickers, where they blew up a ship in the Mediterranean. Sorry, not the Mediterranean, the Gulf of America, or the Caribbean. Sorry, they blew up a ship in international waters, and the idea was, well, this is a law enforcement thing, and those people were not given due process of law. And Trump argued that no, this is essentially a terrorism thing because these drug cartels are killing our citizens, and they also engage in other subversive activities. This is the part where I look at it, and I can look at it from two lenses. One side, I can say, yes, I understand that typically when it comes to narcotics enforcement, that has been a law enforcement function, and that's certainly how we treated it. And again, the larger libertarian argument has been we just legalize drugs, right? But if you look at the justification Trump was using, I think it was fully within the boundaries of the executive branch's power to determine, no, I say you're a terrorist organization, I say you're killing our citizens, and I say that you've been given sufficient warning and you've persisted in this, so now we're blowing you up. Now, is it true? Is it true that that sort of power could theoretically be used in negative ways? Sure. But to some degree, that's just a risk you take with the nature of power. The idea that we wouldn't use our military capacity to go after drug cartels that have actively engaged in terrorist activity, actively engaged in human trafficking, actively engaged in weapons trafficking, actively worked with the Chinese to get fentanyl into the country to kill American citizens. That seems absurd to me. And while I can acknowledge that there could be dangerous precedents set, the threat that we're currently facing is so much more dangerous than any precedent that I'm worried about at this particular time. And that's the part where I look back and I say, look, I'm sorry, I understand the nature of your argument. I don't think it's illegitimate. I don't think it's an illegitimate argument. I think it's overused.
It's what you just highlighted right there is a proceduralist argument. It's this idea that if we're not following the correct process, then the action is illegitimate and it'll lead to tyranny. It'll lead to evil prevailing. It's bad. Yeah. Right. Now there's some problems with that, but the two main arguments that you're seeing from the, whoa, imagine if the roles were reversed, or the, imagine if the shoe was on the other foot side, is the, it's the avoidance of power argument, right? It's the Lord Acton quote that we talked about earlier. It's proceduralism. And then there's a kind of a second component of that, maybe a third, that second one leads into a third one, which is the belief in neutrality. It's this idea that the state shouldn't pick winners and losers. Now, this is commonly argued in the realm of economics, right? It's, well, we shouldn't have subsidies because that's the form of the state picking winners and losers. But the same principle is also commonly applied when it comes to questions, existential questions of things like good and evil, of different interpreting wills, of what should be tolerated or not tolerated. It's this idea that you shouldn't legislate morality. This is a very common thing that occurs within certain classical liberal or libertarian positions.
Well, I think that's okay. I think that's kind of a straw man argument for what they're
Have you not heard people make that argument? I've heard over and over again people say you shouldn't legislate morality.
I do, but I don't generally hear it from libertarians.
Yeah, I usually hear it
I
from
hear
people.
it all the time from libertarians.
I usually hear people on the left do it, but libertarians also do it. It's one of the things they have in common. And that is, also, when you look at it, there are a lot of things that are on the libertarian side that are actually pretty left wing, as far as that goes.
So I think there's a difference here. When the left talks about don't legislate morality, it's usually from a religious connotation. When libertarians talk about it, they're usually talking about people should be relatively free to do what they want, provided they're not hurting other people. And then the conservative approach is that no, there is objective morality, and that objective morality goes beyond just don't hurt other people. It actually has something to say about the way society should be ordered in order to prevent bad things from happening, right? And so, again, that's a very, very brief,
libertarians
nowhere near
tend to,
complete.
They usually use that. They usually use that terminology in order to highlight that there's a lot of social issues that they're very comfortable with that are kind of left-leaning or kind of woke things. Like for instance, usually libertarians are extremely pro LGBTQ. They're pro trans stuff. They're pro.
Some of them, it's
a lot of them are pro abortion. They're very pro pro drugs.
I'm going to push back on this.
Pro stripper poles.
No, I'm going to push back on this because I don't think it's an accurate reflection of libertarian philosophy. Libertarian philosophy is not necessarily pro LGBTQ. They're pro the government not having anything to do with it.
And no, I'm saying that the reason they say we shouldn't legislate morality is because they want to be a big tent that brings that stuff into the libertarian tent.
This is okay. Hang on. There's a way to bridge this divide. This is why I said that third component that kind of flows out of that second component is neutrality.
Yeah.
That's why I said the government shouldn't legislate morality. Now, some people might not use that language.
Yeah.
But that is what they're advocating for when they're advocating for a neutral state. If they're saying I don't want the government to be involved in X, Y, and Z, what they're saying is I want this to be a neutral ground where the state is not picking a winner or loser on this particular social issue. In the same way that they would argue that they don't want the state to be picking winners and losers when it comes to, say, the economic sphere of life.
This
also leads to a fourth point, by the way, which I think this fourth one combined with the previous three fully encapsulates this position, which is the belief that we have to stick with the Constitution. We have to stick with the process and procedure, because if we operate outside that, again, it leads back into the first point of this is a path to tyranny. This is a path to evil.
And that's our one safeguard.
Well, one of the things to remember about classical liberalism as a premise or as a philosophy is that it is rooted in part in this idea that the concentration of power into the hands of one person or too few people is negative. It is inherently corrupting and bad and will lead to bad things. And so therefore, then what's going to govern? And the rules, well, the law will govern, right? A government of laws, not men. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, laws, then the question becomes, okay, who gets to make the laws? And that's where procedures come into play.
Mm-hmm.
And the procedures are there. So the procedure becomes the principle.
Yes.
And look, I think there's some justification to that idea. If you've come up with a noble process, or if you come up with a process that achieves positive ends, you can say that, look, I apply some principle to this procedure. I don't think that's illegitimate in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But to your point, I think where you're going with this is that you can become so consumed with procedure that you
believe the procedure itself is good, regardless of what the outcome of the procedure is.
Yes.
And that is the problem that I have. That's probably one of the biggest problems I have with classical liberalism that I finally came to realize, or libertarianism. And by the way, I'm using these terms. This position that we're describing also applies to some conservatives as well, right?
Yeah,
so just to understand,
because libertarian, it's kind of a big tent, and
yes.
I would say there are a fair number of libertarians that actually aren't pro the Constitution. In fact, there's a fair number of them. I mean, within the libertarian umbrella, you would also find your sovereign citizens.
Yes, but so the point that I'm trying to get across here is I'm using some specific words and labels, but I don't want the audience to be thinking that I'm restricting what I'm talking about to all these people or just these people. For example, I know some people that are libertarians that are like Hoppians or bordertarians, and they're totally friends. They're not enemies, right? Like we're on the same page there in terms. Like if you want to go out into the woods and just be left alone, I want you to be left alone.
Yeah.
I
know that sometimes people don't think that because of the things I say, but I want those type of people. Like I have a good friend, Mike Troxel, that's like that. But shout out Mike. The point is that this camp that we're describing, this first camp, is not just classical liberals or libertarians, because there's some people that might use those labels that actually don't fall into this camp. Mm-hmm. Likewise, there's people that don't use this label that do fall into this camp. There's some people that just call themselves conservatives that can't bring themselves to take any action against the left because they're so concerned about, imagine if the roles were reversed, imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. We can't wield power. That's what tyrants do. We have to respect the process because the process is good.
Well, and no, but here's the other thing that we needed to, here's my critique of it, right? So we've tried to steelman their argument, and we've acknowledged that there's actually some legitimate points there. My critique of them is the idea that they don't even want to use the legitimate mechanisms of power that they have, because they're so afraid of the backlash of them. And that's the part where I look at them and like, guys, you either haven't been paying attention or you don't realize that the other side's not playing by the same rules as you. The only thing that constrains the other side on this is not it's not some sort of grandiose fealty to the Constitution. They're constantly checking the temperature of what they're permitted to get away with. And you saw this under COVID. COVID, the threshold for what the left could get away with changed drastically, and they did as much of it as they possibly could.
Especially after the BLM riots began.
Yes. But you look at COVID, you look at the BLM riots, George Floyd, you look at what they did to Donald Trump. What you saw in each one of those iterations was the left is constantly pushing the limits of what they can get away with within the mechanism that we have. And in part, they're doing that because they've accepted a Gramscian approach to actually changing society. Every once in a while, you see this within American history, every once in a while they move a little bit too far and a little bit too fast. You saw this in the 60s and 70s. You saw it with the manifestation of the Weather Underground. You saw it where leftists were going to try to start race riots. They wanted armed revolution. They were bombing police stations. They thought the soil was fertile enough to do the sort of armed revolution that Marx talks about. And then it wasn't. And then what did they do? What did Bernardine Dorn, what did Bill Ayers, what did these guys do? When they got out of jail, they went into the university system. And so it's not that they've given up on armed revolution. They just recognize that if the soil isn't ready for it, you're not going to get a good harvest and you're going to get a backlash. But we see it from time to time where it's like, push a little bit. And that's the part that I don't think these people understand is that when you're talking to other people that actually agree with you on the various principles with respect to the concentration of power or the problems with it, when they agree with you, then you can have those discussions. But when somebody fundamentally doesn't like our Constitution, that they think it stands in the way of the sort of democracy that they would like to see or the sort of like leftist socialist utopia they like to see, they're only playing by the rules because they have to on some level. And so it's important to understand that. And I don't think that element that's constantly chastising us about it really truly appreciates that. But that leads us into the second group here that we talked about, which we've kind of dubbed the Hail Caesar. This is the group on the right where their attitude is, look, we can only get punched in the face so much before we punch back. And here's a good example. I'm going to use two examples. If the first crowd is like, look, you're allowed to hit once you've been hit. This crowd is, no, I'm going to hit people anytime I see them as my enemy, right? Why? That's stupid. Why would I wait for someone to hit me first before I hit them? Because what if they knock me out? That's dumb. I'm not playing by I'm going to play by their rules.
I'm sorry. I would argue that the first group we talked about doesn't even think it's okay to hit if you've been hit first.
Okay, that's fine.
They think you basically you're like passive across the board. So you got passive, then
you have the people like, no, I'm going to hit first because anytime you give me an indication that you're my enemy, I'm hitting first. Now, to steelman their argument, I'm going to say right off the bat, I'm not in this camp. I'm not in this camp. But to steelman their argument, they do something like this. Have you ever seen, so for instance, you'll see like maybe a 6-year-old or whatnot, they'll get in a fight or they'll hit another kid and they'll take their toy and the parent will come over and spank them. And you'll see this response where it's like, oh, you're going to hit your kid to showing them that hitting is wrong? No. I used an appropriate level of violence in order to demonstrate to my kid that hitting hurts and therefore you shouldn't do it. And it was restrained, right? But it was enough to demonstrate that you shouldn't do that because there's consequences and there's pain involved. That's very, very different than I'm just hauling off and hitting my kid because they angered me. There's a distinction there. So the steelman argument for this approach of like, it's time to just use some force is stop telling me what if the shoe was on the other foot. maybe the only thing they will understand is if they start to feel some of the pain for the very things they've been doing to us. So maybe the way to show them that lawfare is not acceptable is to use lawfare. Maybe the thing to show them that funding all of their little pet ideological projects like they did, like Doge uncovered, maybe the way to show them that that's not an appropriate use of government funds is to start funding the things that we want, and so on and so forth. It's basically they use state power however they want it in order to achieve their objectives. Fine. We're going to use state power however we want to achieve our objectives. And one of two things will happen. Either A, we'll get what we want, or B, at the very least, they'll finally realize this ain't the way to do business.
Where do I sign up? I'm sorry.
That is my steelman argument for their case.
Can I address a few of the as somebody who probably falls into this camp? How do I mean, let's just be honest. I probably do.
Yeah.
And I'm not afraid of it because so each of these points, I wrote these down actually when we were building the outline, and we're not going to bring it up here, but I will read it off to a few people. So the first point that the previous crowd brought up was, this is tyranny. You already answered the question. What are you talking about? We were living under the tyranny of the left for 5 years post-COVID, 4.5 years, right? Mm-hmm. And arguably, we've been living under it for at least a generation. That's the first point. I don't need to imagine if the roles were reversed. They had been reversed. We had been suffering under them for decades. That's the first point. Second point is, the next time that the left takes power, they're going to do something worse next time. What are you talking about? They respect no limitations on authority whatsoever.
That they can get away with.
They respect limitations. They're not going to do something that's totally suicidal to their movement. Yeah. Sometimes they will, right? Sometimes they will cross that boundary and there will be a backlash. But you know what?
They're constantly pushing and testing.
The backlash will never revert it back to before their ideology existed.
Agreed.
And so they're just constantly poking and prodding and pushing the envelope as far as they can go. And the only limitation on power that they respect is how far can they get away with this? That's the second point. Next point is, you're going to betray the founders or the Constitution, which leads into the whole, the process is good in and of itself. Yeah. Well, there's a famous quote it's a meme from a movie. And J.D. Vance actually said this at a speech a few years ago that, if the rule led you to this point, of what use was the rule? Uh-huh. And so, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of like the old, have you ever heard of the Lysander Spooner quote, which is weird because Lysander Spooner was kind of like an anarchist.
Big-time libertarian anarchist.
But post-liberals will sometimes quote Lysander Spooner as well, and they will say, either the Constitution has authorized the current government that we live under, or it was utterly incapable of preventing it from happening. Either way, of what use is it? Now, that's the ultra version of it. And then there's that final point about neutrality and legislating morality and stuff like that. And on that point, the response is very simple. No, morality is the only thing you can legislate. And every regime, and when I say regime, I mean government, right? Yeah. Every ruling power, every ruling ideology, every ruling political theology that has ever existed has had its own mythos. It's had its own sacred and profane. It's had its own right and wrong. It's had its own understanding of good and evil. And neutrality is a myth that we have bought into. We believe, the state shouldn't make this decision. The state shouldn't say that this is right or wrong. We need to let people be free and make their own choices. Well, I've got news for you. A state that bans prayer in public schools and then puts porn in the kids' library is not neutral. Mm-hmm. It's already made a choice. Yeah. And when you adopt the lie that we need to be neutral, we can't make these decisions, that's government tyranny if we make those decisions. Well, guess what? The other side has no issue making that choice of their own. They will then impose their morality, their conception of the sacred, their conception of the good, and it will trample over your conception of it. And so if one side's going to win this thing and one vision of the sacred's going to prevail, it better be ours because we've seen what their vision is.
So again, the Steelman argument, or perhaps just your argument, the Steelman argument for this is the left's, first of all, to the extent that we like these processes and procedures, well, the left's never going to learn because they don't respect them. So now maybe what they should get, they should lose the benefit of those processes and procedures in order to see whether or not they really want, what they claim to be asking for. The second part of it is and this is more of the absolutist point where it's, no, it doesn't matter. There is no neutral ground. One side's going to win, one side's going to lose. And so I just want my side to be the one wielding power. That's kind of the Hail Caesar approach. It's like, look, this just is what it is, and I want my side in charge. Processes, procedures are only useful insofar as they achieve the objectives I want.
Well, it's also
one caveat that must be added.
Yeah.
And this is what I think is an important distinction between what I'm articulating and what actually is a path to tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when we were bringing up the Lord of the Rings reference earlier?
Yeah.
Sauron is too liberal.
Okay, go ahead and explain that.
I think you know where I'm going with this, because what is Sauron's goal? It's to subjugate and dominate the people of Middle Earth.
Uh-huh.
That's his will.
Yeah.
That's not the will of Eru,
So,
who's the god of Middle Earth that created the world. That's kind of Tolkien's own stand-in for himself in a way.
I don't think that analogy holds up.
Do you get where I'm going with this?
Yes. The point you're making. Wait a second. The point you're making is that Sauron is still applying a liberal framework, because his liberal framework is to deny. If classical liberalism or liberalism in general, we'll just say this: if liberalism in general holds itself up to be the ultimate good, right? Well, then Sauron is just saying,
it's prioritizing
I'm a
individual
liberal.
will.
I'm prioritizing my individual will, my self-actualization, and my self-actualization says I get to rule everything, in rejection to God's will,
to the transcendent.
Yes. To the idea that there's an objective truth or morality which I must comport my beliefs, ideas, and identity toward.
Okay.
Yes.
Another element of this is also the fact that every time the left gets in power, they run as far and as fast as they can in the direction they want to go. And then our side never does that. And so this section of people, or this subset of people on the right, they want to see our side go as far and as fast and as hard as we can. And they actually look at some of the other elements within our side of the spectrum and go, you guys are feckless. There's no teeth to anything you do. Yeah. All you're doing is preserving what those guys put in place before. And so it's more of this idea of, let's first of all take away every tool in the left's toolbox, and whether it be defunding certain things and getting rid of getting rid of their ability to funnel funds from one place to the other. Let's just take an axe to all of these agencies. Let's get rid of all of this stuff. Let's add the tariffs and everything else. And so it's this idea that they just want to go so far, so fast, because that's what the left has done. And they know the left's going to try to pull us back the other direction. And so they want to go as far as they can so that it's harder for the left to pull us back.
No. See, but I disagree with how you categorize. I don't.
What do you disagree with?
The group we're talking about right now is not, let's just defund all of this stuff. The group we're talking about now is, no, let's keep this government apparatus in power and then turn it on them. That's the difference between the third group we're about to talk about. This group is like, no, I don't want to necessarily get rid of the Department of Education. I want to keep it to impose our way of thinking on education. I want to keep government power in place. I just want us to wield it.
I just want to come out and say I'm in favor of abolishing the Department of Education.
Yeah, I don't know that you're right on that. I'm not sure you're right.
I know I'm right, because we set up this group. We set up this group to actually talk about a particular category that absolutely wants to wield government power, and they're not afraid. So the left wants to concentrate power in their hands in order to wield it to carry out their end states. What we're talking about is there is a right-wing response to that says the only way that we prevent wokeism in the future, the only way we prevent this sort of degeneracy, is you have a strong state apparatus which punishes that degeneracy. That's the very category we're talking about. So I'm not saying that this describes everybody that wants to use government power. I'm saying that this is the subset that
I think that is maybe the most extreme element of that group. But for the most part, what I see most of these people espousing has more to do with basically taking the reins and going as far as they can with it.
I think that there's a bit of nuance where both of you guys have legitimate points when it comes to describing this group. It's worth noting that not every single person in this second category wants to keep the Department of Education, for example, right? I don't want. I want to get rid of the Department of Education, but to your point, Nick, what we're trying to articulate is.
But do you want the government to play a role in education?
Yes, it will.
Okay, so the point.
I mean, I want to empower families as much as possible, but I'll put it like this: I don't want to empower left-wing families that want to indoctrinate their children into transgenderism.
Yes, that's my point. Right? Is that this is not as simple as this is a group that they just want to use. No, we're talking about three different categories here. One category seems to be afraid to use power even when they have it, because they're so worried about it degrading into tyranny that they never use it. The second category that we're talking about is a group that doesn't think Donald Trump is going far enough. They want to use government power for very specific purposes. They're saying, no, the way we think about education, the way we think about families, the way we think about these things are all good and legitimate. And we should not only push the things we want, we should punish the things that we don't. And you're going to need some sort of government apparatus to do that. Now, there's varying degrees of that, right? There's varying extremes of that. But the whole purpose of talking about this group is that you have people now on the right that are saying classical liberalism is the problem, right? Our Constitution doesn't go anywhere near as far enough. We need to concentrate more power in the hands of an executive that will be able to protect us from these woke monsters. And that is what they believe. And so I think we need to understand that while a lot of the arguments that they're making about that first group of conservatives, resonates with me anyways. Like, I get it. I'm sick of the feckless Republican that the moment they have power, like, oh, well, we can't do it because, we don't have this or we don't have, like, I get it. I get the frustration. Or even when they have the power, they're like, well, gosh, we only have a 2-seat majority. And if we pass this, we're going to lose 2 seats. And the left doesn't seem to operate that way.
Yeah, that's all I was talking about, is that I think what I described does still fit into this category. It's just that we're, I guess, talking about the more extreme version of this group.
Well,
I don't know.
Because if we're all talking about the moderate versions of the groups, and there's no real distinctions that we're making.
Okay, I thought we were steel manning.
Lines can be blurred between all three of these groups, but I think we've done a good job of explaining the first two.
Yeah, the third group is one where...
This is where you fall in.
This is probably where a little bit more where I fall in. But before we get to that, I want to thank a sponsor of today's show, Lear Capital. Speaking of what the government's going to look like, one of the biggest problems that we have within our government right now as it currently exists is they constantly screw up monetary policy. And it's one of the chief ways that you can actually take down a country is by debasing its currency. But Lear Capital has an option for you. And one of the reasons why we've decided to work with Lear Capital is because they focus a lot on education. So for instance, if with no obligation whatsoever, you can actually sign up to get a free investor pack, and they will talk about how you can include precious metals, gold, silver, as well as other options into either a 401k, or you can actually have physical possession. Right? And this physical possession is important because while the government might be able to click something off and debank you in a heartbeat, it's pretty hard if you got the actual precious metals sitting there right there in your safe. So if you want to learn more about how you can add precious metals to either your 401k or to just part of your overall wealth portfolio, go ahead and check out Lear Capital. You can either call 800-707-4575. That's 800-707-4575, or visit nick4lear.com. That's Nick, the number 4, Lear.com. Again, just get the free information packet and hear them out. Hear them out. I think they make some pretty good arguments, but we're very grateful to Lear for sponsoring this episode. Okay, so let's go on this third category. And that third category is the one that I would probably fall into. Now, I would argue that for a good part of my life, I was probably a lot more associated with the first category. I was very, very skeptical of the concentration of power. My attitude was let's limit government as much as humanly possible so we can maximize individual liberty. And I still am a fan of maximizing individual liberty. But the realization I've come to, and this goes back to the John Adams quote I love so much, is that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people, right? It's the idea that if people are not capable of self-regulation, then the more freedom you give them, the more they end up doing horrible, degenerate things. And the libertarian argument is fine. They can do all the degenerate things they want, but they have to assume personal responsibility for their actions. okay, that's wonderful in theory, but what I've seen over and over and over again is that you actually have a political apparatus, you have politicians that will tell those people engaging in those actions that either know they're wonderful and you should celebrate them, and now we're going to give state subsidies to it, or they will say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you've made all these horrible decisions for your life. That's not your fault. There's these evil power structures that set you up for failure. And so now let us subsidize your destructive behavior at the expense of people that are engaging in productive behavior. And it continues to degenerate into this idea that, oh yeah, the real problem is we need criminal justice reform, because the whole reason you're in jail right now is not because you did anything wrong. It's because society failed you. And so I've come to the conclusion that, look, guys, I'm sorry. You may be correct in theoretical land. There is a world where people can be free to do whatever they want, but they have to assume personal responsibility for all their actions. But in the world we occupy, I've noticed it never works out that way. Never. It never works out that way to where when somebody makes a whole series of bad decisions, the government or some politician doesn't immediately come in and take your money or my money in order to make them more comfortable in exchange for their vote. And so they don't correct the bad decisions. They don't make better decisions going forward. They don't realize that their own actions are the cause of their pain, because there's plenty of politicians ready to line up and say that it's society's fault. And so I've come to the conclusion that, look, I am still skeptical of the concentration of government power. I'm still dedicated to principles within classical liberalism, insofar as we define classical liberalism as representative government, limitations on power, free markets, individual liberty, personal responsibility. But here's what I've recognized. Here's what I believe. Classical liberalism is not self-sustaining in and of itself. It actually requires a foundational worldview based on the transcendent that equips people to be able to engage morally. And that there are legitimate, if you don't want people taking matters into their own hands, you have to use the legitimate functions of government in order to punish bad things and on some level encourage good things. Now, I'm not saying that whoever we elect should be the ultimate arbiters of morality. No, I think that's God. But I don't think there's something wrong with having leaders that recognize, okay, it's not my will be done, but there is objective morality, there is objective truth, there is a transcendent source of that. And organizing our laws in such a way as to reflect that reality will produce good results. So what does that mean for the use of power?
What you've articulated there is ordered liberty.
Yes.
Which is something that I'm willing to compromise with.
Yeah.
Nick and I were talking before we started filming, and I was like, we were talking about the Overton window and where people place themselves, and sometimes they might strategically place themselves inside or even sometimes outside the Overton window in order to achieve a purpose. The Overton window, for the audience, is the acceptable scope of what you can get away with in politics in kind of polite company.
Yeah.
And for certainly my entire lifetime, the Overton window has just consistently moved to the left.
Mm-hmm.
It has moved repeatedly to the left, in part because you have people on the extreme far left that get away with identifying as extreme far left publicly. Mm-hmm. You can go out there in public under your own name and be a Marxist and get away with it.
Yeah.
And there is nobody that can go out there and be, far right, reactionary, right? Like those people get canceled, they get shut down, they get deplatformed, all this type of stuff. But you can be Hassan Piker, and say things like America deserved 9/11, right? You can be Destiny and say conservatives need to be afraid to go out in public, and you can still be platformed.
Yeah.
And so some people have just said, to hell with this. I'm going to intentionally place myself as far to the right as possible outside the Overton window in the hopes that me being here will tip the scales enough that the Overton window will start to slide back to the right.
And it is.
And you know what? Some of those people have made some terrible choices in terms of what they've done. They love to counter signal, and I want nothing to do with them. They're idiots and they don't know how this game is being played. But some of those people have also gone outside the Overton window.
Yeah.
And they're willing to accept as a compromise what you just articulated. They might be saying, we need we need Caesar to cross the Rubicon. We need, we need Augustus to, we need a Cincinnatus to come say, they might be saying all this stuff, but what you articulated, that ordered liberty, that, dare I say it, liberal tradition that is still rooted in a form of liberalism that recognized that it was a particular liberalism to the English tradition that was rooted in English common law and Christianity. There was not this universal globalizing, project to remake humanity in almost a Rousseauian sense, right? That ordered liberty is something that I think even a lot of people in the second category would actually accept as an acceptable compromise. That's where we need to be. We need to be having the debate between that and those guys, rather than the current debate between imagine if the roles were reversed and just radical progressive lunatics.
No, I agree. And now that I've kind of put myself in that third camp is to say that, look, I still believe in these procedures. I still believe in the Constitution, but I believe these things have to be, again, built upon something that is deeper and transcendent. Like, I think if you look at the signers of our Declaration of Independence, the authors of our Constitution, if you look at the state constitutions at the founding, what you're going to find is a very, very deep and abiding commitment, legal commitment in many states, to Christianity. And I think it's time that we stop pretending that we can have our Constitution or that we can have our way of life completely separate and devoid from a Christian worldview. Now, that's not to say that you can't be a non-Christian and still be a part and contribute. But even Richard Dawkins, right, the leader of the New Atheists, has recognized that he wants to live in a Christian culture. Even if he doesn't want to adopt that faith, he wants to live in the consequences of a Christian culture, as opposed to the consequences of secular multiculturalism or the consequences of Islam. So that's what I mean when I talk about this idea of a cultural commitment to something. I'm not talking about theocracy. I'm not saying that we should have a priest of the United States that determines what our laws are. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I want a Christian culture because I believe a Christian culture provides the framework for the sort of constitutional republic that I still love and admire. But where we're at right now, I think we need to understand something. There is going to have to be the legitimate use of government power. Otherwise, you are going to get enough people that say your processes, your procedures don't work. And they're going to be looking for somebody else to provide answers. And that's where you get Caesar crossing the Rubicon. And look, to all the classical liberals out there, like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. I'm telling you right now, if you come off as feckless, you deserve to lose. If you're not willing to wield legitimate power with the legitimate fear of the too much concentration of power or tyranny, then you will be seen as not being able to actually address the primary concerns of the day. And the primary concerns of the day are not this horrible concern that Donald Trump is going to use the military to take power and cancel all elections. All right, that's stupid. That's not happening. But now we get into the question of, okay, what constitutes legitimate functions of power that addresses the legitimate concerns of group one about a fear of tyranny, addresses the concerns of group two about not being able to achieve anything, and the real threat that we face right now, and then falls into that third category that, again, maybe I'm setting it up to benefit my own category, but
it is your show.
Hey, yeah. And I would say, I'm going to give some examples. I already gave one. I think it was perfectly legitimate for Donald Trump to blow up that boat in the Caribbean that was carrying drugs to the United States. I have no problem with Donald Trump saying, I'm going to use the military. We have the greatest, strongest military in the world. The left's always complaining about how much money we spend on it. Well, instead of spending on it and creating a bunch of foreign wars where we try to set up liberal democracies in Afghanistan, I'm going to use it to protect the American people from both governments and cartels and terrorist organizations that are engaging in some of the worst behaviors possible. And again, not just with narcotics. If you want to know in part why we have this huge human trafficking problem, look no further than the cartels. So I think it's perfectly fine for him to flex U.S. military power in order to go after those organizations. I'll give you another one. And this is one where I don't think Donald Trump is going far enough. And I don't think Republicans in Congress are going far enough. I am sick and tired of my tax dollars going to educational institutions that teach my kid to hate me, hate their country, hate God, and to revere nothing but leftism. Why are we subsidizing this to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. Why? Well, Nick, you don't support education? No, I don't support indoctrination. And that's clearly what's going on in these institutions. Here's my question, and I've asked this before. If higher ed, if the University of Virginia is going to come to me and say, Nick, we're absolutely essential. Don't you want the Commonwealth of Virginia to have a robust, award-winning university system? My answer is, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But if the only way you're telling me you can achieve that is not by convincing my constituents to give you money in the form of tuition, but instead convincing me to steal it from my constituents to give it to you so that you can then have an entire studies department where you get to push Marxism on a kid that showed up for an engineering degree because you loaded up in their mandatory classes that have nothing to do with their major. No, you can fund that yourself. You don't get a dime of my taxpayers' money. I really want to see this administration go after higher ed like they've never gone after them before. I want to see state legislatures say, you know what? You keep telling us how essential you are. Well, if you're really essential, then do us a favor. Convince the people to voluntarily give you their money. You no longer get to count on us to just give it to you. I want to see them go after higher ed like that big time. I want to see again, same thing with public schooling. I love it when public schools say that if they have school choice, that will steal money from public schools. What do you mean? Wait a second. You mean I'm going to tax people ostensibly to pay for a robust education system? But if I gave a portion of that money back to the parent to be able to choose what school they went to, it would steal money from you? Well, the money's already been, quote, stolen in the form of taxation. Why are you so afraid? Because understand something. If I give the money back to the parent and they can spend it on whatever school they want, they could spend it on your public school. Why are you so afraid they won't go back to you if they had an option? Oh, I know exactly why. If the only way your school can exist is if the law requires people to send you their children, you suck as a school. You suck as a school. You should be able to make a good enough argument to those parents that we are doing a great job educating your child. And if you can't do that, then yes, that parent should be able to take the money associated with their child's education somewhere else. I don't think there's anything wrong with that theory on funding education. There are some people who go even farther and say the government should just not be involved in education at all. Okay, but I'm saying that right now, why shouldn't the dollars follow the students to where the parents want them to go? Another thing that I would say,
I agree with all that.
Well, I'm going to give another example of what I think we should be doing with legitimate government power right now. Trump took over law enforcement in DC. And what did he demonstrate? He demonstrated that in a relatively short period of time, a major metropolitan city can be safe, can be clean, can be a place you can bring your family to without being worried of being mugged, can be a place you live where your kids can get to school without being constantly threatened with gang violence. And then as soon as he talked about doing it in Chicago, and I will acknowledge that there is a constitutional question on whether or not he can do that. Can you really use the Insurrection Act simply because of a high crime rate? That does set a precedent. That I don't know that I'm totally comfortable with. But what did the left do? And this is an important factor here. What did the left do? They immediately said, well, if you really want to go after, why are you going after all these blue states? Why don't you go after the crime in red states? And Trump looked back at him and said, excellent idea. Let's start with Memphis. And the governor of Tennessee was like, cool. Well, now all of a sudden, the constitutional question that you might have had about going into a state that didn't want you there, into a city that didn't want you there, well, now all of a sudden, it's very, very different when you have a state that's asking for it. Can you imagine what would happen if they actually sent the National Guard into Memphis and they cleaned up Memphis in a relatively short period of time?
I think we're about to find out.
Well, and that's the part where I say, look, if you would have just sent it into Chicago, I would have understood it, but I would have had some concerns. But when you send it into Memphis, I'm like, this is actually a great example of what happens when we apply the conservative theory toward criminal justice versus the leftist theory toward criminal justice. And we actually have the ability to show a distinction, a major distinction in the way that conservatives handle crime in a major city versus the way the left does. And so that's the sort of thing where I look at it and I'm like, look, guys, I understand all the concerns, but that's worth a try. That's worth a try.
Right. There's kind of a gray area, and Christian mapped out, he was talking about constitutionally where they're able to get away with this, which I think there's enough gray area to say, yeah, we might not have used it in this way before, but it probably can be used in that way. Just like blowing up those, drug boats. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that there is an element of let's go ahead and test and find the boundaries of where the Constitution lets us go and just push it all the way to the edge until the Supreme Court says, okay, that's far enough. I mean, just take it as far as you can. That's what they've done. That's what they did during COVID. That's what they do with gun laws. They do it all the time until the Supreme Court says, boom, there's the stopping point.
And then they put people in the courts who then said, oh, yeah, you can keep doing it.
Yeah. But I think that,
which, by the way, we can do the same thing.
Well, I think
I'm just pointing that out. We can do the same thing.
Some great examples, too, that I would love to see happen is, again, I want to see a massive reduction in the size of the federal government. I loved it when Trump was given furloughs because we don't need a federal bureaucracy this big. We don't need as many federal departments as we have.
Can I add just one thing to that?
Yeah.
To the crowd in group 1, there is this concern that the group in group 2 or group 3 you kind of articulated this earlier. Well, we just want to use the government for our ends, and so therefore we're going to keep all these agencies and departments. That's not true. Not even for group 2 is that true. I know very few people, because I kind of fall into that second category, and I don't know many people in that second category myself that want to keep, for example, the EPA or the Department of Education or, Housing and Urban Development. There was this guy who had an interview recently, maybe 6 months ago, where he talked about this, and he had this line where he said, power is a zero-sum game, and either we have it or the left has it. And he was addressing this almost classical liberal or libertarian concern about executive authority.
Yeah.
And that man's name was Javier Milei.
Arguably the most libertarian leader in world history. In world history.
and so I just want to address this to the people that are going to call me woke, right?
Yeah.
Or, just because I want to use government power does not mean that I want the government to be as large as it currently is. If I had my way, if I was Caesar, and I don't want to be Caesar, I think I'd be a terrible Caesar. But if I was, right, if I won the lottery and became king for a day, I'd eliminate at least half of the federal government. But the power, the whole point that I'm trying to make is that there will always be power that is exercised.
Yes.
You will never have a pure state of nature, pure anarchy. And so what power is exercised, I do want it to be exercised in furtherance of the worldview that I hold, because I believe that worldview is not just arbitrary, and it's not just my individual will. I'm trying as best I can to align that worldview with something that I think is higher than just individual appetites.
Yeah.
And the concept of just, the floating bundle of rights that is the increasingly atomized individual of modernity. And so it's not that we just want, the right-wing EPA. There is no such thing, right? We just want the right-wing, HUD. There is no such thing. What it is we want to eliminate the organs of state that exist for no other reason than to promote leftism. And we want the remaining organs of state to promote something that is not leftism.
Except you're missing a portion of that middle group that you're talking about right now is the idea of punishing. I've heard you say on multiple occasions that you want to punish the left for what they've done. And so I think that is the element, because there is a lot of similarity between group 2 and group 3, in that they want to put the teeth back into power, right? We don't want to be pacifists. We're not gentle parents here. Okay. Yeah. We want to actually have a disciplined, orderly society. So I think the biggest thing that separates group 2 from group 3 is that group 2 is not satisfied with just pushing the boundary, the Overton window back over. They won't be satisfied unless there is a bit of punishing of the left that goes along with it. And I'm not saying, like, I think there is a fair amount of like, hey, you need a dose of your own medicine because we want to make sure this doesn't happen again. It's that kind of thing. But I think that you might want a little more punishing than just giving.
I'm a huge fan of cancel culture because all societies cancel.
Yeah.
All societies cancel that which they think is profane or evil or bad. And then they elevate that which they think is virtuous, sacred, good.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is not, the problem has never been with cancel culture. The problem has always been with what's being canceled and who's wielding the cancel culture.
Well,
the conservatives for so long just backed away. Again, it's the whole myth of neutrality. We backed away from it and said, no, nobody should be canceled.
We just didn't want to get canceled.
And so guess what happened? The left decided, oh no, you're the, what was it? CEO of Mozilla Firefox who donated to the referendum in California to define marriage as between one man and one woman. We're going to get you fired from your job. These are the same people that years later, 15 years later, came out on their LinkedIn pages celebrating Charlie Kirk's assassination. Oh, you better believe I'm going to find those people, send it to their employer, and get those people canceled. And I did.
Which Christian did. He spent like several days just combing through it, calling employers. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
That was you wielding your power.
Well, no, it was. And the, because I had people sending me stuff. Can you share this? Can you share this? And a lot of it was professors saying things. And I was like, I was always very cautious. Like, you need to make sure that it is the guy. And I would go and I would check. And once I was like certain, I'd be like, okay, share it away. And then we took it from there. But
yeah, we had somebody just in our district, one of the teachers in one of the counties in our district, who basically we got him fired.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, to encapsulate all of this, I think that the first group has legitimate concerns, but they just don't know what time it is, and I'm not sure that they ever will. I feel like they're the sort of people that would be rounded up in camps and be like, "Can you imagine what would happen if we did this to them?" Group two, I'm a little bit concerned that,
like, how far will it go?
I'm concerned that they don't have enough concern for how things can degrade very, very quickly, and how revenge can be the primary motivating factor. And that goes into the whole punishment side of it. Like,
most of the people I see in that group aren't people who have dealt violence. I see a lot of people that want to keyboard deal violence, but not a lot of people that have actually had to wield the weapons in a war setting and deal with that. And I tend to find a lot more of the people in that third category have actually wielded power in that way, where they are the arm that, or were at some point, the arm that was used by the government to go and deal damage. Yeah. And so it is, I feel like there is a mindset difference, because I think it's really easy to go, I want to do all of these things. But part of it's because it's only, you've seen movies that do that. You've got games that do that, but you've never actually seen that done in real life. And when you have, it puts it in a whole different perspective. At least that's what I'm gathering.
No, I've been in situations where I had to hunt down terrorists, and you kick in the door. And look, you have good intel. You have followed all the rules of engagement. You have looked at everything, but you kick in that door, guns up, and you don't know if it's going to be a bomb on the other side. You don't know if it's going to be a guy shooting you to the other side, or you don't know if it's going to be a family sleeping there.
Children.
And I've been there. I've been in there where I found my bad guy, and I've been in there where it's a mother with her newborn infant, and you are constantly trying to go through this process of assess threats at the same time that I'm trying to make sure that she knows that we're not here to hurt her. We're not here to hurt her child. And that's why when I see people getting a little bit too cavalier with that stuff, I'm like, okay, well, I'm telling you right now, things like that can get bad very, very quickly, because all it takes is one thing to happen. And then all of a sudden you're making decisions that you're going to have to live with the rest of your life, and somebody else maybe doesn't have the rest of their life to live with. And so I do think an appropriate amount of respect needs to be maintained for when we talk about weighty issues like this. But kind of back to that re-encapsulation. Group one, I think, needs to grow up and understand what time it is. The gentle parenting phase of this crap is over. Group 2 needs to have a little bit more respect for how bad things can get. When people all of a sudden give in entirely to their passions, even justified feelings of rage or righteous indignation,
The vengeance.
And group 3, needs to understand that legitimate use of government power at this point, or legitimate use of power, is probably the only thing that's going to save you from either being completely crushed or going in a very, very dark direction. If you're not willing to do things like go after the funding mechanisms that the left has used to indoctrinate our children and to give themselves a special standing within society that conservatives are never afforded, what use are you? If you're not willing to actually use law enforcement and military force to enforce the law and protect innocent civilians, what use are you? If you're not willing to, push some of these boundaries in order to make the necessary corrections in places that have just been completely overridden, then what use are you? And I think these are all legitimate things that have to be addressed. And again, I would encourage the Trump administration. I think so far they have actually been willing to push the envelope, but maintain respect for constitutional boundaries. As much as the left wants to talk about, the left has done far more things that are fascist oriented than the Donald Trump administration ever has. Donald Trump wasn't going down and shutting down your church while leaving casinos open. Right? Democrats were doing that. And so going back to our previous episode where it's like, first of all, I'm no longer concerned about accusations from the left. At this point right now, Matt Walsh actually talked about this, where he called up a lot of people on the right and said, look, we have our internal disagreements and we can deal with those, but right now we got to defeat the left. And pretty much everyone was like, agreed. and that's largely where I'm at. Not because, and again, the right can be a broad category. There's certain people on the right that I will never associate myself with, period, the end. But my primary focus right now is defeating wokeism, defeating the critical theorists, defeating leftism, because that's the one that I see as the existential threat right now. And it does have to be defeated. So I would say that within politics, what we need to do is when you look at who you're going to vote for, when you look at when you're going to get involved in politics, here's what I would say. Last episode was stop caring about what people who don't argue in good faith think about you. It's a waste of your time. Start focusing about the things that you can actually do to impact change. When it comes to the political realm that we need to fight for, it is really time to apply the pressure to our representatives on the right to let them know that we're not buying it anymore. We recognize that there are some people in difficult districts, and how do you maintain the majorities and the whole deal? If you are not using the power that you have to actually impact real change, if you are not willing to actually hold your university systems accountable when they do these things, if you are not willing to actually give parents options when it comes to educating their child, if you are not willing to actually enforce the law, whether it be immigration law, or if you're not willing to enforce the law when it comes to just basic crime in your state, if you're not willing to, if you don't have the stomach for it, you need to retire. And please believe me when I tell you that one of the most powerful things you can do, one of the most powerful things you can do in politics, I'm going to give it to you right now. Don't necessarily go after the people in the purple districts. But if you have representatives that live in deep red districts, I'm talking about they win their election every year. They hardly even get a challenger. They win by 20 points without even trying. If those guys aren't willing to do the things that are necessary, those are the guys you primary. It is a total waste of space to have a weakling, to have a category 1 person in an R+20 district. They're a waste of space. I have less respect for that person than I do the left, because at least the left is trying to fight for what they believe in. The guy in the R+20 district that just doesn't want to do anything, they've constantly got a problem with any sort of action. They're holding up a seat for somebody that could do something. And so that's what I would encourage you to do. Try to find people that are, again, I'm not talking about anybody that'll just say what your itching ears want to hear. I'm talking about somebody that is wise, that has relevant experience, but understands this fight for what it is. And go find those people to primary all these category 1 politicians that we have in R+20 districts. Again, the guy that you have in an R+1 or a D+1 that is barely hanging on to the seat, those aren't the guys you need to fight with right now, because at least they're giving you the opportunity to have a majority. But go after the weaklings that we have in these really deep red districts, because that could have a huge impact. Because if you really want to shift the Overton window, if you really want to shift the way that politics are done, those are the people that you need to change out with people that will actually fight. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you found this episode both informative and entertaining. Once again, thank you to our sponsors for this episode. Go check them out as well. Thank you for joining us. And by the way, if you'd like to be a part of the larger conversation in our pregame and postgame, because turns out the episode doesn't end here. We just go into our postgame with our audience, with our circle community. Check out the link in the description. Consider joining over there. We'd love to get your thoughts and questions there as well. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.